So there's a political reporter by the name of Jake Sherman who is seemingly saying he knows who will be in Biden's cabinet or who's being considered. Now, listen, if you want to be skeptical, I get it because he doesn't actually cite a source. But having said that, an outlet like Politico is super establishment, and so they definitely do have connects in the campaign. And they would be the type to get this kind of a scoop where somebody in Biden's staff will whisper in the ear of one of these reporters the following. So here are the people who are floated to potentially be in Biden's cabinet. Chief of Staff Ronald Klain and Steve Ricchetti. I'm going to come back to a lot of these people in a little bit. Secretary of State Abe Blinken, Ambassador Rice, that's Susan Rice, Chris Coons, and Chris Murphy. Secretary of Defense Michelle Flournoy. Attorney General Doug Jones, probably one of the furthest right-wing Democrats, who's about to lose probably his re-election. Treasury Secretary Lyle Bernard. Transportation Secretary Eric Garcetti. Health and Human Services Karen Bass. And they say, could John Kerry end up in a special advisory role? Keisha Bottoms want in. Representative Katie Porter in the mix for an economic job. Where could Mayor Pete end up? And then Tom Steyer is also thirsty, apparently. So I want to give you... This is bad, okay? This is bad, and I'll explain why. Ronald Klain, the first guy we brought up there, he's been a Democratic insider since the 1990s, okay? He's a big-time... He was in venture capital, and he's a corporatist. So he's like, quintessential corporate Democrat type. That's the first one. Every Secretary of State option is a hawk. Every Secretary of State option is a hawk. That's not good if you're, if you want to end these wars and stop the path that we're currently going down and have been going down for decades. The Secretary of Defense is the person who talked Obama into doing Libya. Libya is now a failed state, and they have open slave markets. And apparently, the person that Biden wants for Secretary of Defense is that exact person who's responsible for one of the biggest atrocities, one of the biggest war crimes, one of the biggest illegal interventions. Again, this is like inexcusable stuff. Then we get the Treasury Secretary. The Treasury Secretary worked at McKinsey, and what they focused on were, get this, microloans in Africa. So in other words, big scam, fraudulent thing. She was also in the Clinton administration in the 90s, and she was responsible for ensuring the implementation of NAFTA and preparing the way for China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So, quite literally, the last person you would want for such a job. And I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. You don't want people who are pro-outsourcing. You don't want people who are pro-economic globalization and were in favor of permanent normal trade relations with China. The last people you would want. That's who he's picking. Eric Garcetti, of course, is the mayor of the current crumbling Los Angeles. It's a total mess. And then I think perhaps even more importantly, look at who's not mentioned. Look at who's not named. So you don't have Bernie Sanders. You don't have Andrew Yang. You don't have Elizabeth Warren, even though she sold her soul to tell these people everything they wanted to hear, and they still spit in her eye. The only people who are somewhat decent are Bass and Porter, and those are more question mark choices, whereas the ones that seem more secure are the more corporatist options. So the reason I'm talking about this is because you deserve to know what his administration will look like. But beyond that, I really want to do a reality check to the people who say, oh yeah, we're going to push him left. My ass cheeks, you're going to push him left. You ain't pushing him left. You're not pushing him left. He's going to be a neoliberal corporatist. You know how he's going to govern? He's going to govern exactly how he has his entire career, his entire time in the Senate, his entire time as VP. Every now and then he'll give you something good. Like, for example, probably one of the best things he did was the bailout of GM. That was wonderful. I'll give him nothing but credit for that. I'll give him nothing but credit for the Iran deal, for example. So I'll give credit where credit's due, but just don't expect, like, the best you're going to get is the every now and then thing where you're like, okay, cool. Most of the time it's going to be a neoliberal corporatist and you're going to be annoyed by it. And you're going to be like, wow, this is exactly what everybody was saying who was following this stuff closely. Ain't going to be no pushing them left. It's not happening. You can make an argument for him on the merits as is, but don't, again, I've used this phrase perhaps too many times, don't give me a plate of shit and tell me it's a fudge brownie, because it's not a fudge brownie. And these really are horrendous choices. So, which actually leads to another point, which is one of the things that the left needs to get smarter at, it's not just prodding these Democratic politicians on policy, which you should do. And like I said, Bernie should have cut a deal where he gave specific executive orders. But beyond that, a better thing is, perhaps, they can't fake it with staff positions in the administration. So, in other words, let's say we got Joe Biden to agree to put Ro Khanna as Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. That alone would have way more of a positive impact than, trying to get him to nominally agree to some policy that he probably won't do anyway, or if he does do it, he'll water it down and half-ass it. Having somebody who's actually good on these issues in positions of power really has a lot more influence and can have many more positive material consequences. So that's something to note and bear in mind for the future, that perhaps it's better to get guarantees on staffing positions over silliness, especially like the Unity Commission, which is stuff he's totally going to ignore for sure. This is bad. Honestly, the worst ones, Secretary of Defense is literally the person who talked Obama into doing Libya. So you know what direction he's going to go in. He's going to keep going with the interventions and the bombing and the wars. And the Treasury Secretary, who is responsible for implementing NAFTA, which led to outsourcing so many jobs and getting China in the World Trade Organization. It really is amazing how in D.C. you fail up. Because the reality is, yes, these people are failing. They're failing, but in the eyes of the billionaires and the corporations, they didn't fail. They did exactly what they were put there to do. Because who benefited from NAFTA? Who benefited from permanent normal trade relations with China? Who benefited from these things? It's the owner class. So they look at somebody like who he wants for Treasury Secretary and they go, oh, that's perfect. Even though that person has repeatedly screwed the American people. So anyway, this is upsetting. This is annoying. But it's also, unfortunately, kind of expected.